Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Marcus, I'm 34, and I told myself the humming at Olympic National Forest was just insects. I haven't slept since. The Hoh Rainforest Campground sits deep in the emerald belly of Washington's Olympic Peninsula, where ancient Sitka spruces tower 300 feet above mossy floors that haven't seen direct sunlight in centuries. That's where we parked our rented RV on a Tuesday in late September, when the summer crowds had thinned and the rangers warned us about early frost. The five of us had planned this trip for months, a long weekend to celebrate Jake's promotion at the engineering firm where we all worked. There was Jake himself, 36 and perpetually optimistic, the kind of guy who brought a ukulele on camping trips and actually knew how to play it. His girlfriend Sarah, 29, a veterinarian with gentle hands and a laugh that could diffuse any tension. My younger brother Tommy, 28, who'd been sleepwalking since childhood and took medication that usually kept it under control. And Rebecca, 31, Jake's coworker who none of us knew well but who'd asked to join when she heard about the trip. She had intense green eyes and spoke in soft tones that made you lean closer to hear her. We'd chosen the Hoh for its legendary quiet. No cell service, no distractions, just the white noise of the river and the whisper of wind through needles older than our grandfathers. The ranger who checked us in, a weathered woman named Linda with calloused hands, mentioned that we were lucky to get a spot. Most folks avoid this time of year, she said, her eyes lingering on our group. The forest gets restless before winter sets in. You brought flashlights, right? Good ones. We laughed it off. City people being warned about the dark by locals, it felt like the opening of every horror movie we'd ever mocked. But as we drove the narrow gravel road deeper into the campground, passing empty site after empty site, the humor faded. Our headlights carved tunnels through air so thick with mist it felt solid. The RV was a 30-footer with a queen bed in the back, bunk beds in the middle, and a dinette that converted to another sleeping area. Jake and Sarah claimed the master bedroom, Rebecca took the top bunk, and Tommy and I flipped a coin for the bottom bunk versus the dinette. I lost and spent 20 minutes figuring out how to transform the dining table into something resembling a bed. By the time we got settled, unpacked, and started dinner, full darkness had fallen like a dropped curtain. The generator hummed, casting our little bubble of light against walls of black so complete they seemed to absorb our voices. We grilled burgers on the RV's side-mounted propane grill, the flames dancing in the still air. That's when I first heard it. A low humming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Not mechanical like the generator, but organic, rhythmic, almost musical. You guys hear that? I asked, pausing with my beer halfway to my lips. Everyone stopped talking. Jake tilted his head like a confused dog. Sarah set down her burger. "What humming?" Tommy asked. I listened again. The sound was definitely there, rising and falling like breathing, but when I tried to pinpoint its direction, it seemed to shift. That, like a droning sound. Almost like chanting. Rebecca's fork clinked against her plate. Probably just insects. The humidity here creates perfect conditions for cicadas, even this late in the season. She would know. Rebecca worked in environmental consulting before switching to engineering. But something about her explanation felt too quick, too certain. Cicadas don't usually hum in harmony, Sarah said quietly. As a vet, she'd spent plenty of time around animal sounds. We all listened again. The humming continued, a deep thrumming that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Then, as suddenly as I'd noticed it, it stopped. "Well, that was creepy," Jake said with forced cheer, strumming a chord on his ukulele. "Anyone want s'mores?" But the mood had shifted. We made s'mores and told stories, but our voices seemed smaller against the vast silence that pressed in from all sides. Even Jake's usual repertoire of dad jokes fell flat. When Rebecca suggested we call it an early night, nobody argued. Inside the RV, the close quarters that had felt cozy during setup now felt suffocating. Every creak of the settling vehicle made us freeze. Tommy took his medication, a small white pill that he'd been taking for years to prevent his sleepwalking episodes, and climbed into the bottom bunk. Rebecca disappeared into the tiny bathroom to change, emerging in flannel pajamas that made her look younger, more vulnerable. I lay on the converted dinette, staring at the ceiling and listening to the forest. Without the generator running, the silence was absolute. No distant traffic, no neighbor's TV, no city hum. Just darkness and quiet so complete it felt alive. Around midnight, I dozed. I woke to the sound of the RV door clicking shut. The digital clock on the microwave read 3:06 a.m. I lay still, trying to process what I'd heard. The door had definitely opened and closed, not the violent slam of wind, but the deliberate click of someone operating the handle. "Tommy," I whispered. No response. I sat up and looked toward his bunk. In the dim green glow of the emergency exit light, I could see his bed was empty, covers thrown back. Shit. His medication must not have worked. I'd been dealing with Tommy's sleepwalking since we were kids. Usually it was harmless. He'd wander around the house, maybe go to the kitchen, sometimes stand in corners having conversations with people who weren't there. But we were in the middle of the wilderness now, surrounded by ravines and fallen logs and countless ways to get hurt in the dark. I grabbed my flashlight and pulled on my shoes, trying not to wake the others. But as I moved toward the door, Rebecca's voice stopped me. "Where are you going?" She was sitting up in her bunk, alert in a way that suggested she'd been awake. "Tommy's sleepwalking. I need to find him before he wanders too far." She climbed down without hesitation. "I'll help. You don't have to. I know these forests," she said, already pulling on her boots. "You'll need help." Something about her tone made me pause. How well could she really know these specific woods? But Tommy was out there somewhere, and I didn't have time to question her offer. We slipped outside into air so cold and humid it felt like breathing through wet cloth. My flashlight beam barely penetrated 3 feet into the mist that had risen from the river. The humming was back, stronger now, coming from deeper in the forest. "Tommy," I called softly, not wanting to wake other campers, then remembered we were alone in this section of the campground. Rebecca touched my arm. "Don't call out. Sleepwalkers can become agitated if you startle them awake. We follow quietly and guide them back." She was right. I'd learned that lesson the hard way when we were 12 and I'd shouted Tommy's name while he was standing on our garage roof. He'd spun around, still asleep, and taken a step backward into empty air. 15 stitches and a broken wrist. We found his footprints easily enough in the soft earth. Bare feet headed toward the trailhead that led deeper into the rainforest. The prints were clear and purposeful, not the wandering shuffle I expected from a sleepwalker. "He's moving fast," Rebecca observed, her own flashlight tracking the trail, "and he seems to know where he's going." That bothered me. Tommy's sleepwalking was usually aimless, driven by whatever dream logic his unconscious mind followed. But these tracks showed determination, like he was walking toward something specific. We followed the footprints down the main trail, our lights creating a narrow tunnel through the prehistoric landscape. Massive ferns brushed against our legs. Fallen logs, some thick as cars, forced us to climb over or duck under. The air grew thicker the deeper we went, heavy with the smell of decay and new growth. After about half a mile, the footprints left the main trail. "Shit," I muttered, watching Tommy's tracks veer off into unmarked forest. "He's gone off trail." Rebecca studied the ground with her light. "The prints are still clear. And look," she pointed ahead where broken branches marked Tommy's passage. "He's making a path." We pushed through thick undergrowth, following the trail of disturbed vegetation. Thorns caught at our clothes. Spiderwebs, thick with dew, stretched across our faces. The humming grew louder, more complex, as if multiple voices had joined the chorus. "Rebecca," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "what is that sound?" She paused, head tilted, listening. "I'm not sure." For the first time, her voice carried uncertainty, and that scared me more than the humming itself. We pressed on. Tommy's trail led us deeper into old-growth forest where the trees were so massive their trunks disappeared into our flashlight beams. Some of the Sitka spruces here were over 1,000 years old, ancient when Columbus reached America. Being among them felt like trespassing in a cathedral. After another 10 minutes of hiking, Rebecca grabbed my arm. "Listen," she whispered. I stopped. The humming had changed. It was no longer the deep, regular drone we'd heard at camp. Now it sounded almost like conversation, rising and falling tones that suggested question and answer, call and response. And underneath it, barely audible, I heard Tommy's voice. "Oh, Jesus," I breathed. "He's talking to someone." We pushed through a thick stand of ferns and found ourselves at the edge of a small clearing. Tommy stood in the center, perfectly still, facing away from us. His white t-shirt glowed faintly in our flashlight beams. He was speaking, but so quietly I couldn't make out words. More disturbing was what he was speaking to. The clearing was full of shapes, tall, dark forms that seemed to shift and flow when I looked directly at them. They stood in a rough circle around Tommy, and each one was humming in a different tone, creating the complex harmony we'd been hearing. "Tommy," I whispered, but Rebecca's hand clamped over my mouth. "Don't," she hissed in my ear. "Don't speak. Don't move." I wanted to ask why, but something in her voice froze me. We crouched at the edge of the clearing, watching my brother have a conversation with shadows. Tommy raised his hands, gesturing as he spoke. The shapes around him swayed in response, their humming growing more urgent. I caught fragments of his words now, something about the old paths and finding the way home. Then one of the shapes moved closer to Tommy and I bit down on Rebecca's palm to keep from screaming. It wasn't human. The thing that approached my brother was tall, maybe 7 feet, and wrong in every way. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid. When it turned its head toward Tommy, I saw a face that was almost human but stretched, as if someone had pulled clay before it dried. "We need to get out of here," Rebecca whispered. "Now." But I couldn't move. I watched in fascination and horror as the creature reached out with fingers that had too many joints and touched Tommy's forehead. My brother went rigid, his head tilting back, and the humming suddenly stopped. The silence was worse than the sound. Tommy began walking toward the far side of the clearing, moving with the same determined stride we'd been following. The shapes flowed along with him, keeping their circle formation. Whatever was happening, it wasn't random sleepwalking anymore. "Where are they taking him?" I asked. Rebecca's face was pale in the reflected light. "Deeper." "Deeper where?" She looked at me with those green eyes, and I saw something that might have been guilt. There are places in these old forests that aren't on any map. Places that were here before the maps, before the names. The tribes that lived here had stories about them. What kind of stories? About things that came before. Things that sleep under the trees and wake when they're hungry. A chill that had nothing to do with the night air ran down my spine. "You know what those things are." It wasn't a question. Rebecca nodded slowly. "Then why didn't you warn us? Why didn't you tell us not to come here?" "Because," she said, and her voice was barely audible, "I needed you to come." Before I could process what she meant, she was moving, pushing through the ferns into the clearing. "Tommy," she called. "Tommy, wait!" The shapes spun toward her voice and the humming started again, angry now, discordant. Tommy stopped, but didn't turn around. The tallest of the creatures, the one that had touched him, moved toward Rebecca with liquid grace. I stumbled into the clearing after her, my flashlight beam swinging wildly. "Rebecca, what are you doing?" She was walking toward the creature, her hands raised but not in surrender. She was speaking, but not in English. The words were guttural, rhythmic, like the humming but shaped into language. The creature stopped, its head tilted, listening. Tommy finally turned around and I saw his face clearly for the first time since we'd found him. His eyes were open but not seeing. Dark veins pulsed under his skin, spreading from where the creature had touched his forehead. When he smiled, his teeth looked too sharp. "Marcus," he said in a voice that was his but wasn't. "You came. Good. They've been waiting for you too." Tommy, it's me. We need to go back to the RV. He laughed, and the sound made my skin crawl. The RV? That little metal box? There's so much more here, Marcus. So much more than you understand. Rebecca was still speaking in that strange language, her voice growing more urgent. The creature listened, occasionally making sounds that might have been responses. Finally, it gestured with one impossibly long arm toward the far side of the clearing. They've agreed, Rebecca said, turning back to me. They'll let you go, but Tommy stays. Like hell he stays. He's already changing, she said, and her voice was sad but not surprised. Look at him. I looked. The dark veins had spread further across Tommy's face and arms. His fingers seemed longer, his stance subtly different. And his eyes, when he looked at me, I saw hunger there. Not the warm affection of my little brother, but something alien and calculating. What did you do? I asked Rebecca. What I had to do. She stepped closer to me, and I noticed for the first time that her skin had a faint luminescence, like foxfire. My family has been guardians for generations, keeping the balance, feeding them when they wake. Feeding them what? She didn't answer, but she didn't need to. I understood now why she'd joined our trip, why she'd insisted on coming into the forest with me. We weren't rescuers. We were the meal. The creatures began moving again, flowing toward us with that liquid grace. Tommy walked with them, his movements becoming more like theirs with each step. The dark veins had spread to cover half his face now, and when he breathed, vapor rose from his mouth like winter air. Run, Rebecca said quietly. They're giving you a chance because I asked. Don't waste it. I wanted to grab Tommy, to fight for him, but the rational part of my brain knew it was too late. Whatever those things had done to him, it was irreversible. The brother I'd known since birth was already gone, replaced by something wearing his face, so I ran. I crashed through the undergrowth, branches tearing at my clothes and face. Behind me, the humming started again, but now it sounded like laughter. I followed our broken trail back toward the main path, my flashlight beam jerking wildly as I stumbled over roots and fallen logs. The forest seemed different now, malevolent where it had been merely unwelcoming before. Trees leaned inward, their branches reaching like grasping fingers. The mist thickened until I was running blind, following the narrow tunnel of my flashlight through air that felt solid. I reached the main trail and turned toward camp, but something was wrong. The path looked different, wider in some places, narrower in others. When I checked my compass, the needle spun lazily, unable to find magnetic north. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, and my light fell on Tommy walking up the trail with that same determined stride. But this wasn't the Tommy I'd left in the clearing. The transformation was complete now. His skin had taken on that same luminescent quality as Rebecca's, and his eyes reflected my flashlight beam like an animal's. "Where are you going, Marcus?" he asked, and his voice echoed strangely, as if coming from somewhere deep underground. "We're not finished yet." I ran again, abandoning the trail and crashing through dense forest. Thorns ripped my jacket. Low branches caught my hair. I fell twice, once hard enough to crack my flashlight lens, but I kept moving. Eventually, I saw lights ahead, the warm yellow glow of the RV's windows. I stumbled into our campsite, gasping and bleeding from dozens of scratches. Jake and Sarah were sitting at the picnic table, fully dressed despite the hour. "Marcus," Sarah jumped up. "What happened? Where are Tommy and Rebecca?" I tried to explain, but the words came out in a rush of panic and paranoia. Missing brother, creatures in the forest, Rebecca's betrayal, Tommy's transformation. Even to my own ears, it sounded like the ravings of someone who'd gotten lost in the dark and let fear take over. "Slow down," Jake said, putting a hand on my shoulder. "You're saying Tommy's sleepwalking again? And Rebecca went with you to find him?" "They're not coming back," I said. "We need to leave, now." Sarah looked toward the forest. "We can't just abandon them. They're not them anymore." I grabbed Jake's arm. "Start the RV, we're leaving." But Jake was already shaking his head. "We can't drive these roads in the dark. Too many turns. Too many drop-offs. We'll wait until dawn, then call the rangers. You don't understand. A soft knocking interrupted me. 3 gentle raps on the RV's door. We all froze. Sarah whispered. Tommy? The knocking came again, patient and rhythmic. Knock, knock, knock. Jake moved toward the door, but I grabbed his arm. Don't. It's probably them, he said. They found their way back. No, I said, remembering Tommy's luminescent eyes, the hunger in his transformed face. It's not. But Jake shook me off and reached for the door handle. Before he could turn it, Sarah screamed. A face was pressed against the window beside the door, pale, luminescent, with 2 sharp teeth visible in a too wide smile. It was Tommy, but not Tommy. The thing wearing my brother's face tapped on the glass with fingers that had grown into claws. Let me in, Marcus, it said, its voice muffled by the glass but still wrong, still echoing. I want to show you something wonderful. Jake stumbled backward. Jesus Christ, what's wrong with his face? The knocking started again, but from multiple directions now. Someone, or something, was tapping on every window of the RV. When I looked outside, I saw shapes moving in the darkness beyond our lights. Tall figures that flowed rather than walked, their eyes reflecting like animals. How many are there? Sarah whispered. I counted at least 6 distinct shapes, but more kept emerging from the tree line. The humming started again. That complex harmony we'd heard earlier, but now it was coming from right outside our windows. The engine, I said to Jake. Can we start it without going outside? He nodded, moving toward the driver's seat. But when he turned the key, nothing happened. The engine turned over once, made a grinding sound, then died. Try again, I said. He did. Same result. One of the creatures, not Tommy but the tall one from the clearing, pressed its face against the windshield. Its features were wrong in every way, as if someone had tried to sculpt a human face from memory and gotten the proportions slightly off. It tapped on the glass with one impossibly long finger. They can't get in, Sarah said, her voice shaking. Can they? As if in response, the door handle began to turn. I lunged forward and threw the deadbolt just as the handle reached its full rotation. The door pressed inward against the lock, testing it. Outside, something laughed, a sound like wind through dry leaves. The windows, Jake said. Are they locked? We moved through the RV, checking every latch. Most were secure, but the small bathroom window in the back was slightly ajar. As I reached to close it, pale fingers slipped through the gap. I slammed the window shut on them. There was no cry of pain, just a soft chuckle as the fingers withdrew. They're testing us, I said, looking for weak points. The humming grew louder, more insistent. Multiple voices now, creating harmonies that hurt to listen to. The sound seemed to vibrate through the RV's aluminum walls, making the whole vehicle hum like a tuning fork. Then Tommy's voice, clear and close. Marcus, I found them. I found what Rebecca was looking for. I looked out the window near the dinette. Tommy stood just beyond the circle of our porch light, but he wasn't alone. Rebecca was beside him, her transformation now complete. Her skin glowed with that same foxfire luminescence, and her hair moved as if underwater. She smiled and waved at me. They've been sleeping so long, Tommy continued, hundreds of years, but they're waking up now, and they're hungry. Don't listen to him, Sarah whispered, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. The thing outside looked like Tommy, sounded like Tommy. If I hadn't seen the transformation myself, I might have believed it was really him. They want to thank you, the Tommy thing said, all of you, for bringing them such fresh dreams. That's when I understood. The sleepwalking wasn't just Tommy's old condition acting up. These things fed on dreams, on the unconscious mind that wandered while the body slept. Tommy's medication had stopped working because something had been calling to him, drawing him into the forest where they waited. What do they want? Jake asked. I looked at him. This optimistic man who still thought there might be a reasonable explanation, a way to negotiate with things that had been old when the forest was young. They want us to sleep, I said, as if my words were a signal. The humming changed again. The rhythm became slower, more hypnotic. a lullaby of sorts, designed to make eyelids heavy and minds wander. I felt my own consciousness beginning to drift, the adrenaline that had kept me sharp starting to fade. "Don't," I said, slapping my own face. "Don't listen to it. Don't let yourself sleep." But Sarah's eyes were already drooping. Jake swayed on his feet. The humming was inside my head now, vibrating through my skull, making rational thought difficult. Outside, more shapes emerged from the forest. Dozens of them, all humming in perfect harmony. The creature that had been Rebecca stepped closer to our window and pressed her palm against the glass. Where she touched, frost spread in delicate patterns. "Just a little sleep," she said, and her voice seemed to come from inside the RV. "Just let go. We'll take care of everything." I bit my tongue hard enough to taste blood, using the pain to stay alert. Jake had sat down heavily in the driver's seat, his head nodding. Sarah was curled up on the couch, her breathing becoming slow and regular. "Wake up!" I shouted, shaking Jake's shoulder. "Don't let them in your head." But it was too late. Jake's eyes closed and his body went limp. A moment later, he stood up, but his movements were wrong, too fluid, like a marionette being controlled by invisible strings. When he turned to look at me, his eyes had that same reflective quality as Tommy's. "Sleep, Marcus," he said in a voice that was his but wasn't. "It's so much easier if you don't fight." I backed away from him, my mind racing. Two of my friends were already lost, transformed into something alien. Sarah was unconscious but still breathing, still human for now. Maybe there was still time to save her. But first, I needed to get out of this metal trap. I grabbed my backpack and stuffed it with water bottles and energy bars, moving as quietly as possible while Jake Thing watched me with those predatory eyes. The humming continued outside, patient and inexorable. The only exit I could think of was the roof hatch. It was designed for ventilation, barely big enough for a person to squeeze through, but it was our only option. I climbed onto the dinette table and carefully unlocked the hatch. Cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of old earth and older things. I could hear them out there, not just humming now, but moving, circling the RV like wolves around a campfire. I pulled myself through the hatch and onto the roof, trying not to make noise. The metal was slick with condensation, and I had to move carefully to avoid slipping. Around me, the forest was alive with luminescent figures, dozens of them now, all swaying to their hypnotic rhythm. From the roof, I could see the true scope of what we'd stumbled into. This wasn't just a few creatures hunting in the forest. It was a gathering, an awakening. They stretched back into the trees as far as I could see, an army of things that had been sleeping beneath the old growth for centuries. I dropped my backpack down onto the picnic table and lowered myself after it, landing harder than I'd intended. The sound made every luminescent head turn toward me. The humming stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own heartbeat, my ragged breathing, the whisper of wind through ancient needles. Then, as one, they began moving toward me. I ran. I crashed through the forest without direction, abandoning any hope of following trails or maintaining my sense of direction. Behind me, I could hear them following. Not running, but flowing through the trees with that liquid grace, never hurrying but never falling behind. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs trembled, until the stitch in my side felt like a knife blade. When I finally stopped, gasping and shaking, I found myself in a clearing I didn't recognize. Moonlight filtered through the canopy above, casting everything in silver and shadow. I was alone. The humming had stopped. The forest was silent except for my own harsh breathing and the distant murmur of the Ho River. I pulled out my phone, still no signal, but the GPS showed my location as a gray void. According to the device, I was nowhere. That's when I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from the direction I'd fled. I clicked off my flashlight and pressed myself against the trunk of a massive cedar, trying to become invisible. A figure emerged from the trees. Tall, luminescent, moving with that same liquid grace. But this one was different. Older. Its face was more definitely not human, its limbs longer and more obviously wrong. When it spoke, its voice was like wind through caves. "You cannot run from dreams," it said. "They follow you wherever you go." I held my breath, praying it couldn't see me in the shadows, but it turned its head directly toward my hiding spot. "You brought them to us," it continued. "The sleeper, the guardian's daughter, the innocent ones. Such rich dreams they carry, such delicious fears. Guardian's daughter, Rebecca. Her family had been feeding these things for generations, and she'd brought us here as the latest offering. But something had gone wrong. She'd saved me, given me a chance to escape. Why? She defied us," the creature said as if reading my thoughts. "Tried to protect you instead of delivering you. Such rebellion cannot go unpunished." It gestured, and two more figures dragged something into the clearing. Rebecca, but not the transformed Rebecca I'd seen at the RV. This was the real Rebecca, battered and broken, her luminescent skin flickering like a dying bulb. She thought one act of mercy would absolve generations of complicity, the creature continued. She was wrong. I wanted to help her, but I was one exhausted human against things that had been old when the first trees took root. Instead, I did what she told me to do. I ran. This time, I didn't stop until I saw the lights of Highway 101 through the trees. I stumbled onto the asphalt just as a logging truck rounded the bend, its headlights blinding after hours in the forest. The driver nearly didn't see me in time. His name was Carl, and he didn't ask too many questions when I begged for a ride to the nearest town. Maybe I looked too wild, too broken for normal conversation. He dropped me at a 24-hour diner in Forks, where I used the payphone to call 911. The Rangers found our RV the next morning. Jake and Sarah were inside, unconscious but alive. The medics said they appeared to be in some kind of catatonic state, aware but unresponsive, their eyes tracking movement but showing no recognition. Tommy and Rebecca were never found. The official report blamed carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty generator, causing hallucinations and erratic behavior. Tommy had apparently wandered off during a confused state and fallen into the river. Rebecca had gone looking for him and met the same fate. The Rangers expressed confidence that the bodies would eventually surface downstream. I tried to tell the truth, but who believes stories about ancient creatures feeding on dreams? The psychiatrist they assigned to my case was kind but firm. I'd experienced a traumatic episode brought on by gas poisoning and survivor guilt. The memories would fade with time and therapy. But they haven't faded. If anything, they've grown stronger. Jake and Sarah are in a long-term care facility now. Sometimes when I visit, I think I see recognition in their eyes, but their doctors say it's wishful thinking. They respond to basic stimuli, eat when fed, follow simple commands, but whatever made them themselves is gone. I moved to California after the investigation closed, got a job with a different engineering firm, started over. But sleep remains elusive. When I do manage to doze, I dream of luminescent figures humming in harmony. I dream of Tommy standing in a forest clearing, his face stretched and wrong, calling my name. And sometimes, in that space between waking and sleeping, I hear the humming again, soft and patient, coming from just outside my window. When I look, there's nothing there, just urban streetlights and normal city sounds. But I know they're still out there, in the old forests where maps end and names have no meaning. Waiting beneath trees older than civilization, fed by guardians whose families have kept the ancient contracts for generations. And I know that someday, when my guard is down and sleep finally claims me, I'll walk out into the darkness to join them. Because you can't run from dreams forever. They follow you wherever you go. Story 2. My name is David Henley. I'm 34, and when the sun touched the ridge at Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky, the shadows moved first. I should have known then that we were already being watched, already chosen, but I was too busy arguing with my girlfriend Sarah about the GPS coordinates to notice how the darkness seemed to pool and shift independent of any light source. The campsite should be right here, Sarah said, stabbing her finger at the crumpled map spread across the dashboard of our rented RV. Her auburn hair caught the last golden rays filtering through the windshield, and for a moment she looked like she had when we'd first met 3 years ago. Before the miscarriage, before the fighting, before this desperate attempt to save what was left of us. According to what? I squinted through the bug-spattered windshield at the narrow dirt road ahead. Ancient oaks and maples pressed in from both sides, their branches forming a tunnel so thick that it blocked out most of the sky. This doesn't look like any campground I've ever seen. Our friend Marcus leaned forward from the passenger seat, his thick-rimmed glasses reflecting the dying light. The ranger, at the visitor center, said to follow Flint Ridge Road until we hit the turnoff for the backcountry sites. This has to be it. He'd been the one to suggest this trip, claiming that getting away from cell towers and civilization for a week would help Sarah and me work through our problems. Marcus had always been the mediator in our group, the one who smoothed over conflicts with his soft-spoken logic. "There's supposed to be a sign," Sarah muttered, unfolding another section of the map. Mammoth Cave Backcountry Camping Area B7 through B12. I eased the RV forward, its bulk swaying slightly on the uneven ground. The road, if you could call it that, was barely wide enough for our vehicle. Branches scraped against the roof and sides with sounds like fingernails on metal. The engine's rumble seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet of the forest. "Wait," Marcus said suddenly. "There." I followed his gaze and saw it. A weathered wooden post with a small metal sign hanging at an angle. Most of the letters had faded, but I could just make out B, and what might have been a 9 or a 6. "Close enough," I said, turning the RV down an even narrower track. The suspension groaned as we hit a pothole and Sarah grabbed the armrest. "This thing is going to fall apart before we even get there," she said. "It's fine. These RVs are built for rough terrain." That was a lie. This was a cheap rental from a lot outside of Louisville, the kind of place that asked for cash up front and didn't ask too many questions about your driving record. The interior smelled like stale cigarettes and pine sol, and I'd already noticed a suspicious brown stain on the ceiling above the bed. But it was what we could afford, and it would have to do. The campsite, when we finally reached it, was nothing like the photos on the Park Service website. Instead of a cleared area with picnic tables and fire rings, we found ourselves in a small circular clearing barely large enough for the RV. The trees pressed in on all sides, their trunks disappearing into shadow. Dead leaves covered the ground in a thick carpet that muffled our footsteps as we climbed out to survey our home for the next week. "Well," Marcus said, trying to inject some enthusiasm into his voice, "it's rustic." Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, though the October air was still warm. "It's too quiet. Where are all the birds?" She was right. The forest around us was unnaturally silent. No chirping, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, no buzz of insects. Just the tick of the RV's cooling engine and the whisper of wind through the leaves overhead. "They probably just settled down for the night," I said, though I felt the same unease creeping up my spine. "Let's get the RV leveled and set up camp. We'll feel better once we have a fire going." The next hour was spent in the mundane tasks of making camp, extending the RV's slide-out sections, hooking up the propane, testing the water pump. Normal activities that should have felt comforting but somehow didn't. Marcus busied himself gathering firewood from the edge of the clearing while Sarah and I worked in tense silence, our earlier argument about directions bleeding into every interaction. "The leveling jacks are stuck," I called out, lying on my back underneath the RV with a wrench. The hydraulic system wheezed and complained but wouldn't lift the front end. "Maybe we should just sleep on an angle," Sarah suggested. "It's only one night." "1 week," I corrected, giving the jack another futile turn, "and I'm not sleeping with my head lower than my feet for 7 days." "Fine. Do whatever you want. You always do anyway." I slid out from under the RV and stood up, brushing dirt off my jacket. Sarah had already stalked back inside, letting the door slam behind her. Marcus appeared at the edge of the clearing with an armload of wood, pretending he hadn't heard the exchange. "Find anything good?" I asked. "Plenty of deadfall. But David..." He set the wood down near where we'd decided to build our fire. "Some of this looks weird, like it was arranged." I followed him back to where he'd been gathering wood. He was right. What I'd initially taken for naturally fallen branches were laid out in rough geometric patterns, triangles and spirals that seemed too deliberate to be random. Probably just other campers, I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I didn't believe them. The wood was bone dry, bleached white by seasons of weather. No one had camped here recently. Maybe, Marcus said, but his voice carried doubt. There's something else. I found these. He led me to a massive oak at the edge of the clearing. Carved into its bark about 6 feet off the ground were symbols I didn't recognize. They looked ancient, weathered by years of growth and rain, but still clearly visible. Curved lines that might have been letters in some unknown alphabet, or pictures whose meaning had been lost to time. Probably just kids screwing around, I said, running my finger over one of the markings. The bark felt strangely warm, almost feverish. You know how it is. People think they're being mysterious. But even as I said it, I knew these weren't the work of kids. There was something deliberate and purposeful about the symbols, something that made my skin crawl. They seemed to watch us from the tree's scarred trunk. We returned to camp as full darkness settled over the forest. I finally got the leveling jacks working by hammering on them with a tire iron, a solution that would have made Sarah roll her eyes if she'd been speaking to me. Marcus got a fire started in a ring of stones he'd arranged, and slowly the flickering light began to push back the oppressive darkness. Sarah emerged from the RV carrying 3 bottles of beer and a package of hot dogs. "Peace offering," she said, handing me a bottle. "I'm sorry I snapped. This place just has me on edge." "It's okay," I said, though we both knew it wasn't. Our problems ran deeper than one bad afternoon, deeper than we were probably capable of fixing with a week in the woods. But we had to try. The alternative was admitting that 3 years together had been a waste, that the future we'd planned was never going to happen. We cooked dinner over the fire and tried to make conversation. Marcus told us about the cave systems that gave Mammoth Cave its name, how early explorers had found chambers that stretched for miles underground. Sarah talked about her photography project, how she hoped to capture some images of the forest that would make people understand the importance of wilderness preservation. I mostly listened and drank, letting the beer dull the sharp edges of my anxiety. It was Marcus who first noticed that the stars were wrong. "Does that look right to you?" he asked, pointing up through the gap in the trees above our clearing. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. The constellation pattern overhead wasn't anything I recognized, and I'd been an amateur astronomer since college. These weren't the familiar shapes of Orion or the Big Dipper. Instead, the stars seemed to form angular, unnatural patterns, lines that intersected at impossible angles, shapes that hurt to look at directly. "Maybe the trees are just blocking part of the sky," Sarah suggested, but her voice was uncertain. "No," Marcus said, standing up and turning in a slow circle. "Look around. The stars are moving." He was right. As I watched, the points of light above us shifted and rearranged themselves, sliding across the black dome of sky like they were floating on some invisible current. One particularly bright star, or what I assumed was a star, pulsed in a rhythm that seemed almost like Morse code. 3 short flashes, 3 long, 3 short again. SOS. "That's impossible," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I was reaching for my phone to check the time. The screen showed 11:47 p.m., but that couldn't be right. We'd started dinner around 7, and we hadn't been sitting by the fire for more than an hour or 2. "What time do you have?" I asked the others. Sarah checked her phone and frowned. "It says midnight. That can't be right." Marcus looked at his watch, an old analog model his grandfather had given him. "Mine says 2:30. This is nuts." The fire crackled between us, casting dancing shadows on our faces. In the firelight, my friends looked different somehow, their features sharper, their eyes reflecting the flames in ways that didn't seem quite human. I blinked hard and looked again, but the effect persisted. "I think we should go inside," Sarah said, her voice tight with fear. "Something's not right here." As if in response to her words, we heard it. A sound like crying, distant and mournful, coming from somewhere deep in the forest. It started as a barely audible whimper, then grew louder and more desperate. The sound of a child in distress, lost and terrified. "Jesus Christ," Marcus whispered. "Is that a kid?" The crying continued, echoing off the trees in a way that made it impossible to determine which direction it was coming from. It seemed to surround us, bouncing back and forth through the forest like a ricocheting bullet. "We have to help," Sarah said, starting to stand. I grabbed her arm. "No, we don't go into those woods. Not at night." "But what if there's really a child out there? What if they're hurt?" The crying stopped abruptly, cut off mid-sob as if someone had thrown a switch. The silence that followed was even more unnerving than the sound had been. We sat, frozen around our fire, straining our ears for any hint of what might be out there in the darkness. Then the crying started again, but this time it was closer, much closer. It seemed to be coming from just beyond the edge of our clearing, hidden among the trees. And there was something wrong with it now, something that made my skin crawl. The pitch was off, too high and too low at the same time, like multiple voices crying in harmony. "That's not a child," Marcus said quietly. The sound moved around us in a slow circle, staying just outside the reach of our firelight. Sometimes it would stop for long minutes, leaving us in tense silence, then resume from a completely different direction. It was toying with us, I realized. Whatever was making that sound was enjoying our fear. "The RV," I said, standing up slowly. "We need to get inside the RV." We gathered our things quickly but quietly, trying not to make any sudden movements that might provoke whatever was out there. The crying had stopped again, but I could feel something watching us from the trees. Multiple somethings, maybe. Eyes that reflected no light but somehow registered as pairs of bright spots in my peripheral vision. We made it to the RV without incident, but as soon as I closed and locked the door behind us, the crying resumed. This time from directly overhead. Something was on the roof, moving back and forth with heavy footsteps that made the whole vehicle rock slightly. "Turn on all the lights," Sarah whispered. I flipped every switch I could find, flooding the RV's interior with harsh fluorescent light. Outside, the footsteps stopped. Then, slowly, something began to scrape across the roof. It sounded like fingernails on metal, long, deliberate strokes that set my teeth on edge. "What the hell is that?" Marcus asked. Before anyone could answer, the scraping stopped. A moment later, we heard a soft tapping on the windows. Not random tapping, but a deliberate pattern. 3 short taps, 3 long, 3 short. The same SOS pattern we'd seen in the stars. Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging into my skin. "It's trying to communicate." "Don't respond," I said. "Don't do anything." But Marcus was already moving toward one of the windows, drawn by curiosity despite the obvious danger. Maybe it's hurt. Maybe it needs help. "Marcus, no." He pulled back the curtain and peered out into the darkness. What he saw made him stagger backward, his face drained of all color. "Oh, God," he whispered. "Oh, God, oh, God, oh, God." "What? What did you see?" He couldn't speak, could only point at the window with a trembling hand. I moved to look for myself, but Sarah grabbed my other arm. "Don't," she said. "Please don't look." But I had to know. I had to see what had frightened Marcus so badly. I pulled back the curtain and looked out. At first, I saw nothing but darkness and the dim outline of trees. Then my eyes adjusted, and I saw them. Faces pressed against the glass. Not human faces, but something that was trying very hard to look human. The features were wrong. Eyes too large and too far apart, mouths that stretched too wide, skin that had a waxy, artificial quality like a mannequin's. There were 3 of them, maybe 4, crowding around the window. As I watched, one of them smiled, revealing teeth that were far too sharp and far too numerous. It raised one hand, if you could call it a hand, and tapped on the glass again. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. I jerked the curtain closed and stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. "We're leaving, right now." "We can't drive in the dark," Sarah protested. "Not on these roads." "I don't care. We're not staying here." I moved to the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine turned over once, twice, then died. I tried again with the same result. On the third attempt, it didn't even turn over, just clicked uselessly. "The battery's dead," I said, though I knew that was impossible. The engine had been running fine just a few hours ago. The tapping resumed, this time on multiple windows at once. They were surrounding us, whatever they were. I could hear them moving around the RV, could hear their feet, or what passed 4 feet, scratching against the aluminum siding. Then Sarah screamed. I spun around to see her pointing at the rear window of the RV. There, pressed against the glass, was the face of a child. A little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, with long blonde hair and wide blue eyes. She looked perfectly normal, perfectly human, except for the fact that she was floating 6 feet off the ground. The girl smiled and waved at us, the innocent gesture somehow more terrifying than all the inhuman faces we'd seen. Then she opened her mouth and began to cry, that same impossible multi-toned wailing we'd heard from the forest. "Don't look at her," Marcus said, his voice barely audible. "Don't make eye contact." But it was too late. The girl's eyes had locked onto mine, and I felt something cold and invasive crawling through my thoughts. Images flashed through my mind. Not my own memories, but something else's. Dark chambers deep underground. Tunnels that stretched for miles beneath the earth. Things that lived in the spaces between spaces. I was seeing through the girl's eyes, I realized. Seeing the vast network of caves that honeycombed the ground beneath Mammoth Cave National Park. But these weren't the mapped caves that tourists visited. These were older places, deeper places, where things had lived and died and been forgotten for so long that they'd become something else entirely. The girl at the window tilted her head, studying me with those impossibly blue eyes. Then she smiled again and began to sing. A lullaby in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood. It was a song about sleeping, about going down into the dark places beneath the earth where dreams became real and reality became dreams. I felt myself being drawn toward the window, toward that sweet, hypnotic voice. Part of me wanted to open the door, to follow the singing girl down into the caves where I would never have to worry about saving my relationship with Sarah, or finding a job that paid enough to support the family we'd never have, or any of the other endless anxieties that plagued my days. "David," Sarah's voice snapped me back to awareness. I was standing at the rear door of the RV, my hand on the lock. I had no memory of moving from the driver's seat. "She's not real," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "Whatever that thing is, it's not a real little girl." The singing stopped abruptly. The girl's face twisted into something ugly and predatory, her eyes becoming black pits in her skull. She opened her mouth impossibly wide, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth, and let out a shriek that seemed to come from everywhere at once. All the windows of the RV exploded inward simultaneously, showering us with glass. The creatures that had been waiting outside poured through the openings like a living tide of darkness. They moved wrong, their limbs bending at angles that shouldn't have been possible, their fingers too long and too sharp. Marcus screamed as one of them grabbed him, its claws sinking deep into his shoulders. Sarah was backing toward the front of the RV, a piece of broken glass held out in front of her like a weapon. The floating girl drifted through the shattered rear window, her feet never touching the ground. I grabbed the tire iron I'd used earlier to fix the leveling jacks and swung it at the nearest creature. The metal passed right through it like it was made of smoke, but the thing recoiled anyway, hissing at me through a mouth full of broken teeth. "The fire!" Sarah shouted. "They don't like the light." She was right. The creatures seemed to shy away from the brighter areas of the RV, clustering in the shadows near the broken windows. I lunged for the light switches, flipping on every lamp and overhead fixture I could reach. The creatures writhed and hissed, but they didn't retreat. Marcus wasn't screaming anymore. The thing that had grabbed him was doing something to his neck, and dark blood was spreading down the front of his shirt. His eyes were wide and staring, but there was no consciousness behind them anymore. "Marcus!" I swung the tire iron again, this time connecting with something solid. The creature holding my friend let out a sound like breaking glass and released him. Marcus collapsed to the floor, his body twitching spasmodically. The floating girl drifted closer, her ruined face split by that impossible grin. "Come with us," she said in a voice like rustling leaves. "Come down below where it's safe, where you'll never have to hurt again." "Go to hell," I snarled, raising the tire iron. She laughed, a sound like wind chimes made of bone. "We've been there. It wasn't nearly as interesting as this place." Sarah was pressed against the far wall of the RV, still clutching her makeshift weapon. Between us and her, Marcus was changing. His skin was turning gray and waxy, and his limbs were elongating in ways that made my stomach turn. Whatever these things were, they could transform their victims into more of themselves. The girl's attention turned to Sarah, and I saw the same hypnotic effect beginning to take hold. Sarah's eyes glazed over, and she began to lower her piece of glass. "No!" I threw myself between them, breaking the line of sight. The girl hissed at me, her beautiful face becoming something from a nightmare. I had to get Sarah out of here. The RV was compromised, overrun with creatures that seemed to exist somewhere between reality and nightmare. But outside was no better. The entire forest was their domain. Then I remembered something Marcus had said earlier about the cave systems beneath the park. These things came from underground, from the deep places where sunlight never reached. They were creatures of darkness and depth, which meant, "The fire!" I shouted to Sarah. "The campfire outside, it's still burning." She blinked, coming out of her trance. "What?" "Fire, light. It's the only thing that seems to affect them." I grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the shattered front windshield. The creatures tried to block our path, but I swung the tire iron in wide arcs, keeping them at bay. They couldn't seem to touch the metal directly, as if it burned them. We climbed through the broken windshield and dropped to the ground outside. The campfire was indeed still burning, its flames casting a circle of warm light in the clearing. The creatures followed us through the windows, but stopped at the edge of the firelight, forming a ring of hungry eyes and grasping claws. Sarah and I huddled near the fire, adding wood to keep the flames high. The creatures circled us like wolves, just outside the reach of the light. Occasionally, one would test the boundary, reaching a claw or tentacle toward us, only to recoil as if burned. "This won't last forever," Sarah whispered. "We'll run out of wood." She was right. We had enough fuel for maybe a few more hours, and then a new sound reached us from inside the RV. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. Something emerged from the shattered windshield, and my blood turned to ice. It was Marcus, or what had been Marcus. His body was elongated and twisted, his limbs too long and too thin. His face was still recognizable, but wrong. His eyes were black pits, and his mouth stretched too wide across his skull. He moved with the same unnatural gait as the other creatures. "Hello, David," he said in a voice like grinding stone. "Hello, Sarah. It's so good to see you." "Marcus," Sarah sobbed. "Oh God, Marcus." "Don't," I warned her. "That's not Marcus anymore." The thing that had been our friend smiled, revealing teeth like broken glass. "Of course I'm Marcus. I'm just better now. Enhanced. Free from all the pain and worry and fear that used to plague me." It gestured to the creatures surrounding us. "We all are. And we can make you better too." "What do you want?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. "You've seen what's down there," it said, pointing toward the ground. "The vast chambers beneath the earth, the endless tunnels and caverns. We've been alone down there for so long, David. So very long. We need company. We need friends." The floating girl drifted closer to the edge of the firelight. "It doesn't hurt," she said in her sweet, innocent voice. "The change is actually quite pleasant. Like falling asleep and waking up is something wonderful." I looked around at the circle of creatures, trying to count them. There were at least a dozen, maybe more. Too many to fight, even if I had better weapons than a tire iron. And they were patient. They could wait for our fire to burn down. Wait for exhaustion to take hold. Wait for us to make a mistake. "There has to be another way out of this," Sarah whispered. I was about to tell her there wasn't, that we were trapped and doomed, when I noticed something. The creatures were all focused on us, drawn by our fear and our warmth. But they were also clustered together, forming a tight circle around our fire. "Sarah," I said quietly, "how much gas is left in the RV's tank?" She blinked, not understanding. "I don't know. Maybe half a tank." "Why?" Can you create a distraction? Something to draw their attention? What are you planning? Something stupid, I admitted. But it might work. Sarah looked at the tire iron in my hands, then at the ring of creatures surrounding us. Okay, she said. But whatever you're going to do it fast. She picked up a burning branch from the fire and hurled it at the nearest creature. The thing recoiled with a shriek, and for a moment the circle wavered as several of them moved to avoid the flames. I sprinted toward the RV, tire iron in hand. The creatures tried to intercept me, but they couldn't move quickly in the light from Sarah's improvised torch. I reached the vehicle and dove underneath, feeling for the gas tank. The fuel line was protected by a metal plate, but the tire iron made short work of it. I punctured the tank in several places and gasoline began to pour out onto the ground. The sharp smell filled the air, making my eyes water. The creatures had realized what I was doing and were converging on the RV. I could hear them scrambling over the roof and sides, their claws scraping against metal. One of them dropped down beside me, its face inches from mine. This close, I could see that its flesh was translucent, revealing things moving underneath that might have been organs or might have been something else entirely. I swung the tire iron, connecting with its skull. The impact felt like hitting wet sand, and the creature's head caved in with a sound like breaking eggs. It didn't die. I wasn't sure these things could die, but it was stunned long enough for me to roll out from under the RV. Gasoline was pooling around the vehicle now, the fumes making the air shimmer. I ran back to Sarah, who was still wielding her burning branch to keep the creatures at bay. "Get ready to run," I told her. "Run where? They'll follow us." "Not if we give them something else to worry about." I grabbed a long piece of wood from our fire, one end blazing like a torch. The creatures seemed to sense what was coming and began to retreat, but they were too late. I threw the burning wood toward the RV. It landed in the spreading pool of gasoline. The explosion was bigger than I'd expected. The RV disappeared in a ball of orange flame that lit up the entire clearing. The shockwave knocked Sarah and me to the ground, and I felt the heat wash over us like a furnace blast. The creatures caught in the explosion didn't just die, they unraveled. Their impossible anatomies couldn't withstand the sudden presence of so much light and heat. They came apart like smoke sculptures touched by wind, dissolving into wisps of shadow that dissipated in the firelight. But not all of them were caught in the blast. The thing that had been Marcus was still standing at the edge of the clearing, his elongated form silhouetted against the flames. The floating girl hovered beside him, her face twisted with rage. "That was unnecessary," Marcus said, his voice carrying a note of genuine sadness. "Now, we'll have to do this the hard way." The surviving creatures began to advance again, but they moved differently now, more cautiously with a respect for our capacity for violence that hadn't been there before. They were learning, adapting to our tactics. "We can't keep this up," Sarah said. "There are too many of them." She was right. The burning RV would provide light for a while, but eventually it would burn down to nothing. And then we'd be back where we started, except with fewer options. That's when I heard it. The distant sound of an engine. A car, maybe, or a truck, coming down the access road toward our campsite. Someone was coming. The creatures heard it too. They paused in their advance, their heads turning toward the sound like a pack of wolves detecting an intruder in their territory. "Help!" Sarah shouted at the top of her lungs. "Help us!" The engine sound grew louder, and I saw headlights cutting through the trees. A Park Service truck rounded the bend and pulled into the clearing, its driver's side door already opening before it came to a complete stop. A man in a ranger uniform stepped out, and I felt a surge of relief that was immediately crushed by what I saw next. The ranger's movements were wrong, too fluid and too deliberate. His face was perfectly symmetrical in a way that human faces never were. And his eyes were the same black pits I'd seen in the creatures. "Good evening," the ranger said in a voice like silk over steel. "I got a report of a disturbance in this area. Is everything all right?" The thing that had been Marcus smiled, the first genuine expression I'd seen on its twisted features. "Everything's fine, officer. Just a little camping accident. Nothing that can't be cleaned up." I looked around the clearing and realized we were completely surrounded now. The creatures had used our distraction to close off every escape route. The burning RV cast dancing shadows on their inhuman faces, and in that flickering light they all looked like broken dolls. Beautiful and terrible at the same time. "Sarah," I whispered, "when I say run, head for the trees. Don't look back." "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you." It was a lie, and we both knew it. But it was the kind of lie that people tell when they love someone more than they love their own survival. The ranger stepped closer, his hand resting on what looked like a service weapon but probably wasn't. "You folks need to come with me. This area is off limits after dark." "Run," I said. Sarah hesitated for just a moment, and in that moment I saw everything we'd been to each other, everything we'd planned to become. Then she turned and sprinted toward the tree line. The creatures moved to intercept her, but I threw myself into their path, swinging the tire iron with desperate fury. I connected with one, then another, buying Sarah precious seconds to reach the relative safety of the forest. Something sharp pierced my back. Claws, I thought, or maybe teeth. Pain exploded through my nervous system, but I kept fighting. I could hear Sarah crashing through the underbrush, getting farther away with each second. More claws found me, tearing through my jacket and into the flesh beneath. I fell to my knees, the tire iron slipping from my hands. The creatures swarmed over me, and I felt the same cold invasion I'd experienced when I'd made eye contact with the floating girl. But this time, it was different. Instead of trying to lure me down into the caves, they were bringing the caves up into me. I could feel my body beginning to change, my bones stretching and reshaping themselves. The pain was indescribable, but underneath it was something worse. A sense of welcoming, of coming home to a place I'd never been but had always belonged. "Don't fight it," the ranger said, kneeling down beside me. "The transformation is so much easier if you don't fight it." I wanted to resist, to hold on to my humanity for as long as possible. But the changes were happening too fast, and part of me, a growing part, didn't want to resist at all. The caves were calling to me, vast and dark and peaceful. A place where Sarah and I could be together forever, where our problems would dissolve into blissful unity with something larger than ourselves. I was almost gone when I heard the gunshot. The sound echoed through the clearing, sharp and immediate. One of the creatures holding me jerked and let out a shriek, its form beginning to unravel like the others had in the fire. More gunshots followed, and I looked up to see figures moving at the edge of the clearing. Real park rangers, I realized. Humans, armed with weapons and flashlights and, most importantly, knowledge of what they were fighting. "Incendiary rounds," one of them shouted. "Light 'em up." The creatures scattered as burning projectiles began to find their targets. Whatever these ammunition types were, they affected the things the same way fire did, causing them to dissolve into shadow and smoke. The false ranger who had tried to capture us let out a sound like breaking glass and fled into the forest. Strong hands pulled me to my feet, and I found myself looking into the face of a real human being. A woman in her 50s with graying hair and kind eyes. "Can you walk?" she asked. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure it was true. The transformation process had been interrupted, but I could still feel its effects in my system. My bones ached, and my vision kept shifting between normal sight and something else, a way of seeing that revealed the vast network of tunnels beneath our feet. "My girlfriend," I managed to say. "Sarah. She ran into the woods." "We'll find her," the ranger promised. "But right now, we need to get you out of here. This area is about to become very dangerous." As if to emphasize her point, the ground beneath our feet began to rumble. Something large was moving in the caves below, responding to the disturbance above. Cracks appeared in the earth around the clearing, and I could hear sounds from deep underground. Howling, scratching, the rush of things with too many legs scuttling through darkness. The rangers formed a protective formation around me, their weapons trained on the tree line as we moved toward their vehicles. Behind us, the burning RV was beginning to collapse in on itself, sending up a pillar of smoke that would be visible for miles. We found Sarah half a mile down the access road, huddled behind a fallen log with her piece of broken glass still clutched in her hands. She was in shock, barely responsive, but physically unharmed. The rangers loaded us both into their truck and drove us out of the forest as fast as the narrow roads would allow. I learned later that the Park Service had been dealing with incidents in the backcountry areas for decades. The caves beneath Mammoth Cave National Park were older and more extensive than any official map showed, and some of them connected to places that weren't entirely on this plane of existence. Every few years, campers would disappear or come back changed, and the rangers would have to go in with special equipment to clean up the mess. Marcus was never found. Neither were the bodies of the creatures we'd destroyed. Apparently, they didn't leave physical remains when they were killed. The official report listed our experience as a bare encounter with complications, and we were strongly advised not to discuss the details with anyone. Sarah and I left Kentucky the next day, but we didn't leave together. The drive to the hospital had been conducted in silence, both of us staring out the windows at the forest that lined the road. Every shadow between the trees seemed to move with purpose. Every rustling branch sounded like claws on bark. The rangers had given us blankets and coffee, but nothing could warm the chill that had settled deep in my bones. At the emergency room, they treated us for cuts from the broken glass and gave Sarah something for the shock. The doctor who examined me spent a long time looking at the wounds on my back, frowning at the pattern of scars that didn't match any known animal. "These are unusual," he said, probing one of the deeper marks, almost like they were made by surgical instruments. Very precise. I didn't tell him that they'd been made by something trying to remake me from the inside out. Some truths are too dangerous to share. They kept us overnight for observation, and it was during those long hours in the sterile hospital room that Sarah finally spoke about what she'd seen in the forest after she ran. "They followed me," she whispered, staring at the ceiling. "Not the monsters. The people. Real people, I thought. A family with children, camping in the woods. They had a fire going, and they invited me to sit with them." She paused, and I saw her hands trembling beneath the thin hospital blanket. "The children were wrong, David. They looked normal at first, but when I sat down by their fire, I could see they were hollow, like shells. And the parents, they kept asking me questions about you, about Marcus, about why we were really there. They knew things about us they shouldn't have known." "What kind of things?" "About the miscarriage, about how we blame each other, about the fight we had last month when you stayed out all night and wouldn't tell me where you'd been." She turned to look at me, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "They knew all of it, David. Every secret, every lie, every moment of pain we've been carrying around." I reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "They offered to take it all away," she continued. "The hurt, the guilt, the fear of not being enough for each other. They said I could join their family, that I could be one of their children, and I would never have to feel anything bad again. But you didn't go with them." "I almost did." Her voice was barely audible. "I was so tired of hurting, so tired of pretending we could fix this. For a moment, being hollow seemed like the better option." "What stopped you?" She was quiet for so long I thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her words cut through me like broken glass. I realized that the pain was the only real thing left between us. If I gave that up, there would be nothing left of who we used to be. The next morning, Sarah's sister came to pick her up. They didn't speak to me beyond a polite goodbye, and I understood that whatever we'd had was ending here, in this antiseptic room that smelled of disinfectant and defeat. I stayed in Kentucky for another week, ostensibly to give a more detailed statement to the Park Service, but really because I had nowhere else to go. The rangers were kind but distant, treating me like a survivor of something they couldn't quite explain to themselves. They told me that the backcountry areas would be closed indefinitely for geological assessment, which I assumed meant they were trying to figure out how to seal whatever had been living down there. On my last day, the senior ranger, the woman who had pulled me out of the clearing, came to see me at my motel. "There's something you should know," she said, settling into the uncomfortable chair by the window. "About your friend Marcus." My stomach clenched. "You found him?" "Not exactly." She pulled out a manila folder and opened it to reveal several photographs. These were taken by trail cameras in the area over the past 6 months. The photos showed various outdoor scenes, empty trails, wildlife, normal forest imagery. But in the background of several, barely visible among the trees, was a familiar figure. Tall, Too thin, with features that might have belonged to Marcus if you didn't look too closely. "He's still down there," I said. It wasn't a question. In a manner of speaking, the things that live in those caves, they don't just kill or transform their victims. They preserve them, use them. Your friend is part of their community now, but some echo of who he was remains. She showed me the final photograph, taken just 3 days earlier. The figure was closer to the camera this time, close enough to make out the face clearly. It was definitely Marcus, but wrong in all the subtle ways I'd seen in the clearing. His smile was too wide, his eyes too bright, and he was holding something in his hands. A sign, hand-lettered, the kind of thing you might see at a roadside fruit stand or advertising a garage sale. It read, "David, come back. We miss you." "He's been leaving these all over the park," the ranger said quietly. "Different locations, different messages, but all addressed to you. The things down there, they remember everyone who escapes, and they never stop trying to call them home." I left Kentucky that afternoon, driving my rental car west without any particular destination in mind. I just needed to put distance between myself and those caves, between myself and whatever Marcus had become. But distance doesn't matter when you're carrying the infection inside you. It started small, moments of disorientation where I'd lose track of time, finding myself parked on the side of a highway with no memory of stopping. Dreams that felt more real than waking life. Visions of vast chambers filled with pale figures who sang lullabies in languages that predated human speech. The physical changes were subtle at first. My bones ached constantly, especially at night. My vision would shift unexpectedly, revealing layers of reality that shouldn't exist. Underground rivers, cave systems, networks of tunnels that ran beneath every city and town I passed through. I tried to find help. Doctors ran tests that came back normal. Psychiatrists prescribed medications that did nothing. Sleep specialists couldn't explain why I spent most of my nights wide awake, staring at walls and listening for sounds that came from below rather than above. 3 months after leaving Kentucky, I was working a construction job in Nevada when I had my first real episode. We were digging foundations for a new housing development, and when the excavator hit bedrock, I heard it. The sound of something vast stirring in the depths below. I dropped my tools and ran, not stopping until I was miles away from the construction site. When I finally came to my senses, I was standing in the middle of the desert, the sun beating down on my head, with no clear memory of how I'd gotten there. That's when I knew the transformation wasn't over. It had just been waiting. Now, 6 months later, I understand what's happening to me. The creatures in the caves, they don't just change their victims physically. They create a connection, a psychic link that spans any distance. I'm becoming their scout, their advance agent in the surface world. I can feel them down there, moving through tunnels that connect every cave system in North America. They're spreading, growing stronger, and they need people like me to help them find new hunting grounds, new communities to absorb. Sometimes I fight it. I'll drive myself to exhaustion, take pills to stay awake, do anything to avoid the dreams where they call to me. But the resistance gets weaker each time, and I can feel my human consciousness being slowly subsumed by something older and hungrier. Sarah sends me emails occasionally, brief messages checking to see if I'm okay. I don't respond anymore. What would I tell her? That I can see the cave systems running beneath her apartment building in Portland? That I know exactly which entrance would give the creatures easiest access to her neighborhood? That sometimes, in my weakest moments, I think about leading them there myself. The worst part isn't the physical changes or the loss of time or even the growing hunger for things I don't want to name. The worst part is that I'm starting to understand why Marcus looks so peaceful in those trail camera photos. The caves aren't just a place of horror. They're a place of belonging, of perfect unity with something larger than individual consciousness. They're calling to me right now, even as I write this. I can feel the pull, stronger than it's ever been. There's a cave entrance 40 miles south of here, hidden in a canyon that doesn't appear on any map. I know exactly how to find it, exactly how to navigate the tunnels that will take me home. I'm going to try to resist for a little while longer. Maybe I'll drive east instead of south, put more distance between myself and their call. Maybe I'll find some way to break the connection, to cut the psychic umbilical cord that's been feeding on my humanity since that night in Kentucky. But I know how this ends. I've seen it in the dreams they send me, felt it in the way my bones ache for the comfort of stone and darkness. Sooner or later, I'll stop fighting. I'll follow the song that calls to me from below, and I'll find my way back to the vast chambers where Marcus is waiting with his too-wide smile and his signs that spell out messages in my name. The only question is whether I'll go alone, or whether I'll bring company. I think about Sarah sometimes, about the pain she carries and how easy it would be to take it away. I think about her sister, her co-workers, the barista at the coffee shop she frequents. So many people in pain. So many who would benefit from the peace that comes with transformation. The caves are patient. They've been waiting for thousands of years, and they can wait a little longer, but not much longer. I can feel them stirring now, responding to my thoughts. Something is moving. In the depths below this motel, in the network of sewers and steam tunnels and forgotten spaces that connect every building in every city, they know where I am. They've always known, and they're coming to bring me home. The last thing I need to do is leave this account somewhere it will be found. A warning, maybe, or a confession. Something to explain what happened to the man I used to be, before I become something else entirely. To anyone who finds this, stay away from the backcountry areas of Mammoth Cave National Park. Don't trust the rangers who smile too much or have eyes that reflect light wrong. Don't follow the sounds of children crying in the darkness, and don't believe the floating girl who promises that transformation doesn't hurt. And if you see a tall, thin man with Marcus's face standing at the edge of your campsite, holding a sign with your name on it, run. Run as far and as fast as you can, and don't look back. Because if you do look back, you might see me standing behind him, no longer quite human, but not yet fully transformed, holding my own sign with your address written in neat block letters. We miss you, it will say. We're coming to take you home. The stars are moving again outside my window, arranging themselves into patterns that spell out directions to places that don't exist on any surface map. The caves are calling, and I'm tired of pretending I can't hear them. It's time to go home. But first, I have some visits to make. Story 3. My name is Marcus, I'm 34, and I never forget a face. The Bridger Teton National Forest taught me to. I was haunted by the last words of a stranger. Don't look at it. The RV park outside Jackson, Wyoming sits in a valley carved by glaciers and shaped by nightmares. I'd driven 12 hours from Denver with my girlfriend Sarah and her cousin Jake, fleeing the suffocating routine of office cubicles and city noise. The Winnebago we'd rented felt like freedom on wheels, 40 feet of steel and fiberglass promising adventure in the wilderness. Sarah had found this particular campground online, a place called Whispering Pines that offered authentic backcountry experience with modern amenities. What the website didn't mention was how the trees pressed close to the road like curious children, or how the silence between their branches felt expectant, hungry. We pulled into our designated spot as the sun balanced on the ridgeline, painting the aspens gold and the pines black. Site 17. The number was burned into a wooden post that leaned at an angle, as if the earth beneath it had shifted. Sarah emerged from the passenger seat stretching, her dark hair catching the light, while Jake immediately started pulling gear from the storage compartments with the methodical precision of someone who'd rather be busy than still. "This is perfect," Sarah said, breathing deep. "Smell that air." I smelled pine sap and something else, something organic and sweet, like fruit left too long in the sun. But I kept that observation to myself. Sarah had been planning this trip for months, marking hiking trails on laminated maps and researching the area's wildlife with the enthusiasm of someone determined to fall in love with nature. I didn't want to dim that light in her eyes, especially not after the year we'd had. Her father's cancer diagnosis, my mother's stroke, the slow erosion of certainty that comes with watching the people you love become fragile. Jake slammed the compartment door harder than necessary. Let's just get this thing leveled before it gets dark. At 26, He carried himself like someone who'd learned early that the world disappoints, and his default expression suggested he was still waiting for the next letdown. He worked construction, which meant his hands were always scraped and his back always ached, and he'd agreed to this trip more to get away from his ex-wife's lawyers than from any love of the outdoors. The campground stretched along a creek that chattered between smooth stones, with maybe a dozen sites scattered among the trees. Most were empty. We'd chosen late September specifically to avoid crowds, though now the isolation felt less peaceful than ominous. A few other RVs dotted the spaces, their windows glowing amber in the gathering dusk, but their occupants remained invisible. I was crouched beneath our rig, adjusting the leveling jacks when the man appeared. He emerged from the trees like smoke given form, so quietly that I only noticed him when his shadow fell across the manual I was reading. Tall and gaunt, with the kind of deep tan that comes from decades of outdoor work, he wore faded jeans and a flannel shirt that might have been red once. His eyes were the color of creek water, pale and constantly moving, and when he smiled, I saw teeth too white for a man his age. "Evening, folks." His voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned to approach strangers with caution. "Name's Dale. I manage this place." Sarah walked over, extending her hand with the easy confidence that had first attracted me to her. "I'm Sarah, this is Marcus, and that's my cousin Jake. We reserved Site 17 for 3 nights. Dale's handshake lasted a beat too long, and his eyes lingered on her face with an intensity that made my jaw tighten. "Pretty girl like you shouldn't be out here this time of year," he said, still holding her hand. "Things get strange when the seasons change." "Strange how?" Jake asked, straightening from where he'd been connecting the electrical hookup. Dale released Sarah's hand and turned those pale eyes toward Jake. "Oh, you know, animals acting different. Sounds that don't match what makes them. City folks getting turned around on trails they swore they knew." He paused, studying each of our faces in turn. "You planning on doing much hiking?" "Some," I said, standing and wiping grease from my hands. "Nothing too ambitious." "That's smart." Dale nodded, but something in his expression suggested he doubted our wisdom. "Just remember, these mountains don't care about your plans. They got their own way of doing things." He pointed toward a trail that disappeared into the darker trees beyond the creek. "That path there? The Whispering Creek Trail? Beautiful during the day. Lots of elk sign, some decent fishing holes, but don't you go wandering it after sunset." Why not?" Sarah asked, and I heard genuine curiosity rather than challenge in her voice. Dale was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. When he spoke, his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "There's things in these woods that ain't quite right. Been that way since I was a boy, and my grandfather told stories that went back further than that. Most times they leave folks alone. But when the light gets thin and the shadows get long," he trailed off, shaking his head. "Well, just stick to the campground after dark. That's my advice." "What kind of things?" Jake pressed, and I heard skepticism in his tone. Dale fixed him with a stare that could have frozen the creek. "The kind that wear faces they didn't earn. The kind that know your voice better than you do." He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small object, pressing it into Sarah's palm. "You take this. Old crow charm my grandmother made. Maybe it's just superstition, but it's kept me safe for 63 years. Sarah looked down at the object, a small pouch made of dark leather, tied with sinew and decorated with beads that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "I can't take this. It's obviously important to you." "It's more important that you have it." Dale stepped back, creating distance between himself and us. "I got to check on the other sites before full dark. You folks have yourselves a pleasant evening, and remember what I said about that trail." He melted back into the trees as quietly as he'd appeared, leaving us standing in the amber glow of our RV's awning light. The silence stretched until Jake laughed, though it sounded forced. "Well, that wasn't ominous at all. What do you think? Local color, or is the old guy actually crazy?" "Don't be an ass," Sarah said, but she was examining the charm pouch with obvious fascination. "I think he's just trying to look out for us." I watched the spot where Dale had vanished, feeling an itch between my shoulder blades that suggested we were still being observed. "Maybe we should listen to him?" About the trail, I mean. Since when are you the cautious one? Sarah slipped the charm into her pocket and smiled at me. Remember who talked me into that zipline tour in Costa Rica? She was right, of course. I'd always been the one pushing for adventure, the one insisting we try the harder trail or stay out later to catch the perfect photograph. But something about this place felt different. The very air seemed thick with warnings I couldn't quite decipher. We finished setting up as the last light drained from the sky, and I tried to shake off the unease that had settled over me like a damp shirt. Inside the RV, Sarah heated up the chili we'd brought while Jake fiddled with the satellite radio, hunting for a signal that kept sliding away from his grasp. The LED lights cast everything in harsh white relief, making our movements look jerky and unnatural against the dark windows. "No signal," Jake announced, switching off the radio with obvious frustration. "What's the point of modern technology if it doesn't work when you actually need it?" "When do you need satellite radio?" Sarah asked, ladling chili into bowls. "We came here to get away from all that. I just like to know what's happening in the world." Sue me. They were developing that edge siblings get when forced into close quarters, the old tensions rising like heat from a fire. Sarah and Jake had been close as children, but a dozen years of different choices and mutual disappointments had worn their relationship thin. This trip was supposed to be a chance to reconnect, though I was beginning to suspect it might accomplish the opposite. We ate in relative silence, the only sounds the whisper of the wind through the trees and the occasional creak of the RV settling. Through the windows I could see the faint glow of other campsites scattered through the darkness, but they felt impossibly distant. When Sarah suggested we build a fire in the ring outside, I almost said no. But the thought of sitting in this metal box with the tension crackling between her and Jake felt worse than whatever might be waiting in the dark. The fire caught easily, the dry wood snapping and popping as flames climbed toward the star-scattered sky. We arranged our chairs in a semicircle, our backs to the RV and our faces toward the woods. The warmth felt good against the chill that had settled with the darkness, and for a while, the atmosphere lightened. Sarah told stories about her work at the animal shelter, making us laugh with impressions of the various personalities she encountered daily. Jake shared war stories from construction sites, his voice losing its defensive edge as he fell into the rhythm of familiar tales. It was during one of these stories, something about a foreman who'd accidentally concrete sealed his own truck keys in a foundation, that I first heard it. A whisper, so soft it might have been wind through pine needles. But wind doesn't form words, and this did. 3 words, spoken in a voice I recognized but couldn't place. "Don't look at it." I stopped mid-laugh, my head turning toward the sound. "Did you guys hear that?" "Hear what?" Sarah asked, following my gaze toward the tree line. "Someone said something. Like a warning." Jake leaned forward, firelight dancing across his face. "I didn't hear anything, man. You feeling okay?" I listened for another long moment, but the woods had returned to their normal symphony of settling branches and distant owl calls. "Yeah, sorry, must have been the wind." But it hadn't been the wind, and as the night wore on, the words echoed in my memory with increasing clarity. I'd heard that voice before, though I couldn't remember where. It carried the weight of genuine fear, the kind that comes from knowledge rather than imagination. We stayed by the fire until the logs collapsed into glowing coals, trading old stories and watching the stars wheel overhead. The Milky Way stretched from horizon to horizon, more vivid than I'd ever seen it. But even its beauty couldn't entirely dispel the sense that we were being watched from the darkness beyond our small circle of light. When we finally retreated to the RV, I found myself checking the locks on the door twice before settling into the narrow bed Sarah and I shared. She curled against my side, her breathing quickly evening out into sleep, but I lay awake listening to the sounds of the forest. Somewhere in the distance, an elk bugled, a haunting call that seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have. Closer, a branch snapped with the sharp report of something heavy moving through the underbrush. And once, just before dawn, I heard footsteps circling our RV, slow, measured steps that paused at each window before moving on. I told myself it was Dale, making his rounds to ensure his guests were safe, but the spacing of the steps was wrong. Too long for a normal human stride, and they moved with a patience that felt distinctly inhuman. Morning came gray and cold, with mist rising from the creek like the ghosts of drowned things. I woke to find Sarah already up, standing at the small kitchen window with a cup of coffee in her hands. Her expression was troubled, and when she turned to me, I saw the same unease I'd been fighting. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked. "Some. You?" "Not really." She sipped her coffee, wincing at the heat. "I kept thinking I heard things. Probably just unfamiliar sounds, but what?" She hesitated, then set down her cup and moved to the window that faced the forest. "Come look at this." I joined her and immediately understood her concern. The ground around our RV was soft from recent rain, perfect for holding tracks. And there were tracks, dozens of them, forming an almost perfect circle around our site. But they weren't made by any animal I recognized. They were roughly human in shape, but wrong in proportion, with toes that seemed too long and a gait that spoke of something that walked upright but didn't quite understand how. "What do you think made those?" Sarah asked, her voice carefully neutral. Before I could answer, Jake emerged from the fold-out couch that served as his bed, his hair sticking up at odd angles and his face creased with the marks of restless sleep. "Morning, campers. Please tell me someone made coffee." "Look at this first," Sarah said, pointing toward the window. Jake joined us, and I watched his expression shift from sleepy irritation to sharp attention as he processed what he was seeing. "What the hell? That's what we're trying to figure out," I said. Jake pulled on his boots and headed for the door. "Well, standing here won't solve anything. Let's go take a closer look." Outside, the tracks were even more disturbing. They were pressed deep into the soft earth, suggesting something heavier than it should have been for its size. The pattern was methodical, as if whatever made them had been studying our RV from every angle, learning its layout and vulnerabilities. "Bear?" Sarah suggested, though her tone indicated she didn't believe it. "Wrong shape," Jake said, crouching beside one of the clearer prints. "And look at this." He pointed to marks near what would have been the heel. "These look like claw marks, but they're in the wrong place. Like whatever made them was trying to walk on two legs but couldn't quite manage it." I felt something cold settle in my stomach as I examined the tracks more closely. They formed a complete circuit around our site, but they also led to specific points of interest. Our water hookup, our electrical connection, the small window of our bathroom, as if something had been learning not just our location, but our habits and needs. "We should talk to Dale," I said, "see if this is normal around here." But when we walked to the small office building near the campground entrance, we found it dark and empty. A handwritten sign taped to the door read, "Back later, emergency in town." The writing was shaky, as if done in haste, and the edges of the paper fluttered in the morning breeze like nervous wings. "So much for local expertise," Jake muttered, peering through the office windows at empty desk chairs and a phone off its hook. We walked back to our site in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The tracks were still there, of course, but in the growing light of day they seemed less ominous. By the time we'd finished breakfast, I'd almost convinced myself they were the result of an exceptionally large raccoon or perhaps a young bear walking on its hind legs. Unusual, but not impossible. Sarah suggested we hike the Whispering Creek Trail, the same one Dale had warned us away from. "It's barely 9 in the morning," she pointed out. "If there's something weird about it after dark, we'll have plenty of time to get back." Jake agreed with the enthusiasm of someone desperate to prove his courage, and despite my reservations, I found myself outvoted. We packed day packs with water and snacks, grabbed our cameras and set off across the creek on a fallen log that served as an impromptu bridge. The trail was everything Dale had promised, beautiful and well-maintained, winding through stands of aspen and pine that filtered the morning sunlight into a constantly shifting pattern of gold and green. The creek ran alongside the path for the first mile, its voice a cheerful counterpoint to the sound of our boots on packed earth. Sarah documented everything with her camera, exclaiming over the play of light through leaves and the way mist still clung to the water in sheltered pools. For a while, the peace of the place worked its magic. The tracks around our RV seemed like a minor mystery, the kind of thing that would make a good story once we were back home. Jake's mood improved as we walked, and he and Sarah fell into the easy rhythm of shared memories from childhood camping trips with their grandparents. I found myself relaxing for the first time since we'd arrived, the knot of anxiety in my chest gradually unwinding. The first sign that something was wrong came at the 2-mile mark, where the trail branched. According to our map, we should continue straight to reach the scenic overlook that was our destination. But someone had placed a cairn, a small stack of stones, at the intersection, and tied to its top was a strip of bright orange surveyor's tape that fluttered like a warning flag. "That's not on the map," Sarah said, consulting the laminated trail guide we'd picked up at the visitor center. Jake studied the branching path which curved away from the creek and climbed steeply through darker trees. Probably just a side trail, maybe a shortcut to the overlook. "Or maybe a trail that gets people lost," I countered, remembering Dale's warnings about the mountains having their own way of doing things. But Sarah was already walking toward the unmarked path, drawn by the photographer's instinct for the unknown. "Let's just see where it goes. If it seems wrong, we'll turn back." The decision felt significant in a way I couldn't articulate, like stepping across a threshold into a room you might not be able to leave. But Sarah was already 20 feet up the side trail, and Jake was following, and I found myself falling in behind them rather than being left alone at the intersection. The unmarked trail was narrower than the main path and less maintained, with roots that caught at our feet and branches that grabbed at our clothes like grasping fingers. The air grew cooler as we climbed, and the sounds of the creek faded behind us until the only noise was our own breathing and the whisper of wind through pine needles. After half an hour of steady climbing, we emerged into a clearing that definitely wasn't marked on any map. It was roughly circular, perhaps 50 feet across, and completely barren of vegetation. The earth was hard-packed and gray, as if it had been scoured clean by some immense heat or chemical action. In the center stood a single dead tree, its bark stripped away and its branches twisted into shapes that suggested agony. "Well, this is cheerful," Jake said, but his voice lacked its usual sarcasm. Like the rest of us, he was staring at the tree and feeling something primitive crawl up his spine. Sarah raised her camera, then lowered it again without taking a shot. "There's something wrong with this place." She was right. The clearing felt empty in a way that went beyond the absence of plants. No insects buzzed, no birds called, no small animals rustled in the surrounding underbrush. Even the wind seemed to avoid the space, leaving it wrapped in a silence so complete it made my ears ring. I was about to suggest we leave when Jake pointed toward the far edge of the clearing. "What's that?" Scattered around the base of the dead tree were objects, dozens of them, arranged in no pattern I could discern. As we moved closer, I realized they were personal belongings. A child's sneaker, a baseball cap, a water bottle with a university logo, a smartphone in a cracked case. All of them showed signs of weathering, as if they'd been here for months or years. "Lost and found?" Sarah suggested, but her voice carried no conviction. I picked up the smartphone, surprised to find it still held a partial charge. The lock screen showed 17 missed calls from Mom and a text message notification that read, "Where are you? Please answer." The timestamp on the messages was from 3 months ago. "We need to leave," I said, dropping the phone like it had burned me. "Right now!" But Jake was already at the tree, running his hands over its stripped bark. "Check this out. These marks, they're not from any animal I know. The trunk was covered in scratches and gouges, but as I looked closer, I realized they weren't random. They formed patterns, spirals and angular shapes that hurt to look at directly, as if they were designed to confuse the eye and slip away from conscious understanding. "It's like writing," Sarah said, joining Jake at the base of the tree, but in a language I don't recognize. The moment she spoke those words, something changed in the clearing. The silence deepened, becoming thick and oppressive, and I had the sudden, overwhelming sensation that we were being watched. Not by human eyes, but by something that understood observation in a fundamentally different way. "We're leaving," I said, grabbing Sarah's arm. "Now." But when I turned toward the trail we'd used to enter the clearing, it wasn't there. The trees pressed close together in an unbroken wall of green and brown, with no gap large enough for a person to pass through. "Where's the path?" Jake asked, his voice climbing toward panic. We spread out, searching the perimeter of the clearing for any sign of the trail that had brought us here. But the forest had closed around us like a fist, offering no hint of exit or escape. It was as if the path had never existed, as if we had always been trapped in this dead place beneath the watching eye of the stripped tree. "This isn't possible," Sarah said, her breathing quick and shallow. "Trails don't just disappear." But impossibility, I was learning, was a luxury we could no longer afford. We were trapped in a place that shouldn't exist, surrounded by the belongings of people who had vanished, under the gaze of something that wrote messages in tree bark and erased trails like pencil marks. The sun was still visible through the canopy overhead, but its light seemed dimmer here, filtered through air that felt thick and stale. I checked my watch and was disturbed to find that the hands had stopped, frozen at 11:47, though I couldn't remember what time we'd entered the clearing. "Our phones," Jake said suddenly. "Maybe we can get a GPS signal." But our phones, like my watch, had stopped working. The screens remained dark no matter how long we held the power buttons, as if the devices had been drained of more than just electrical energy. "There has to be another way out," Sarah said, though her voice carried no conviction. "Clearings don't just trap people." We spent the next hour, or what felt like an hour in that timeless place, walking the perimeter of the clearing, pressing against the wall of trees, searching for any gap or weakness. But the forest remained impenetrable, and our efforts only served to demonstrate the completeness of our confinement. It was during this futile search that I found the notebook. It was wedged between two stones at the base of the dead tree, its pages yellow with age and moisture. The cover bore the name Michael Chen in fading blue ink, and the first entry was dated 8 months ago. "Day 1, I read aloud. "Found this place by accident while hiking the Whispering Creek Trail. Can't find the way back to the main path. Sarah and Jake think I'm losing it, but I know something is wrong here." Sarah grabbed the notebook from my hands. "That's not possible. You're Michael, and I'm Sarah. This is some kind of joke." But as she flipped through the pages, her face went white. The entries detailed our exact situation. 3 people trapped in a clearing that defied rational explanation, searching for an exit that didn't exist. But according to the notebook, this Michael had been trapped here for weeks, watching his companions change and deteriorate until they were no longer quite human. "Day 12, Sarah read in a shaking voice. "Jake hasn't spoken in 2 days. Just stands at the edge of the clearing, staring into the trees like he's waiting for something. When I called his name this morning, he turned around, but his eyes, they weren't his eyes anymore. They were too pale, too empty, like someone had reached inside and scooped out everything that made him Jake." Jake snatched the notebook away. "This is bullshit. Someone's playing games with us. There's a logical explanation for all of this." But as he spoke, I noticed that his voice sounded different, flatter, with an odd echo that seemed to come from somewhere behind his teeth. And when I looked into his eyes, I saw what the notebook's author had seen. They were still brown, still shaped like Jake's eyes, but they held an emptiness that made my skin crawl. "Jake?" I said carefully. "How are you feeling?" He smiled, and it was Jake's smile but wrong somehow, like a photograph that had been slightly overexposed. "I'm fine, Marcus. Better than fine. I think I'm starting to understand this place." Sarah backed away from him, clutching the notebook to her chest. "Understand what?" "That fighting it is useless. The clearing doesn't want to hurt us. It wants to help us become something better, something more suited to this place." The words came out in Jake's voice, but they carried a cadence and rhythm that belonged to someone else. As if something was wearing his vocal cords like an instrument it was still learning to play. "Jake, listen to me," I said, moving slowly toward him. "Something is happening to you. Something bad. We need to fight it." "Fight what?" His head tilted at an angle that was just slightly wrong, like a bird studying an interesting insect. "I feel more myself than I ever have. Don't you want to feel that way too?" I looked into his eyes and saw depth there, but it was the wrong kind of depth, like looking into a well that went down farther than wells should go. And in that darkness I caught a glimpse of something looking back. Sarah grabbed my arm. We need to get away from him, but there was nowhere to go. The clearing was maybe 50 feet across, and Jake, or the thing wearing Jake's face, stood between us and the dead tree where we'd found the notebook. We backed toward the edge of the clearing, but the wall of trees offered no sanctuary, only the illusion of shelter. "Where are you going?" Jake asked, following us with those 2 patient steps. "We're supposed to stay together. That's what families do." "We're not family," Sarah said, but her voice shook with uncertainty. "Aren't we?" Jake smiled wider, and I saw that his teeth were too white, too sharp. "We've been together so long, shared so many experiences. I know you better than you know yourself, Sarah. I know that you blame yourself for your father's cancer. I know that you sometimes wish Marcus would just make a decision instead of always asking what you want to do." The accuracy of his observations hit like physical blows. These were things Jake might have guessed, but the certainty with which he spoke suggested knowledge that went deeper than guesswork. "And Marcus," Jake continued, turning those empty eyes toward me. "I know about the accident, the one you've never told Sarah about, the little girl who ran into the street while you were texting, how you drove away because no one saw, and how you've been carrying that weight ever since." My legs went weak. I'd never told anyone about that day 3 years ago, had barely allowed myself to think about it. The girl had been hurt but not killed. I checked the news obsessively for weeks afterward, but the guilt had carved a hollow space inside me that nothing could fill. "How do you know that?" I whispered. "I know everything about you," Jake said. "Every secret, every shame, every small cruelty you've tucked away in the dark corners of your heart. That's what happens when you stay in this place long enough. The boundaries between us start to dissolve. We become part of something larger." Sarah was flipping through the notebook with desperate speed, searching for answers or escape routes or any information that might help us survive. According to this, the other group found a way out on day 15. She stopped reading, her face going pale. "What is it?" I asked. "They didn't escape," she said quietly. "They became something else. Listen to this. Day 15. Jake and Sarah don't look like themselves anymore. Their faces shift when they think I'm not watching, cycling through expressions that don't belong to them. And sometimes when they speak, I hear my own voice coming out of their mouths. I think they're practicing, learning to be me." The thing wearing Jake's face laughed, and the sound was like glass breaking in a church. Poor Michael. He fought so hard against the inevitable, but in the end, he learned to appreciate the gift he'd been given. "What gift?" I demanded. "Immortality, continuation. When your old self dies, we preserve what was valuable and discard what was flawed. You'll be perfected, Marcus, made into something worthy of this place." I felt a presence pressing against the edges of my consciousness, something cold and vast and alien trying to find purchase in my thoughts. It whispered seductive promises of peace and understanding, of release from the burden of being human. All I had to do was stop fighting, stop holding so tightly to the small painful thing I called myself. For a moment, the temptation was overwhelming. To let go of the guilt and fear and constant anxiety that defined my existence, to become part of something larger and more purposeful than my individual mortality. But then I looked at Sarah, saw the terror in her eyes, and remembered why being human was worth defending. "No," I said, pushing back against the presence with every ounce of will I possessed. "I won't let you take me." The thing wearing Jake's face frowned, and for a moment its features flickered, showing glimpses of other faces, older, younger, from different times and places, all of them wearing the same expression of patient hunger. "That's disappointing," it said, "but not unexpected. Resistance is part of the process. It makes the eventual surrender more complete." Sarah had found something in the notebook, her finger tracing lines of increasingly frantic handwriting. "Marcus, look at this. The last entry. It says there's a way out, but only if you're willing to pay the price." "What price?" She looked up at me with eyes full of desperate hope and terrible knowledge. "Someone has to stay behind. Someone has to feed the tree." The dead tree in the center of the clearing seemed to pulse at her words, its twisted branches reaching toward us like grasping fingers. And I understood, with the cold certainty of nightmare logic that the objects scattered around its base weren't lost belongings. They were offerings. Pieces of the people who had been consumed to keep this place alive. "That's not an option," I said. "It might be the only option." Sarah's voice was steady, but I could see the calculation in her eyes, the terrible mathematics of survival. "If one of us stays, the others might be able to leave." "No," I said again, more firmly. "We find another way." But even as I spoke, I could feel the presence pressing harder against my thoughts, and I saw that Sarah was struggling against the same invasion. Her face flickered occasionally, showing glimpses of expressions that didn't belong to her. The thing that had taken Jake was working on both of us now, trying to turn us against each other, to make us willing participants in our own destruction. "Sarah," I said, grabbing her hands, "look at me. Whatever it's showing you, whatever it's promising, don't listen. We stay together." She blinked, and for a moment her eyes cleared. "Together," she agreed. "But Marcus, I can feel it inside my head. It knows things about me, things I've never told anyone. Fight it. Remember who you are." "I'm trying, but it's so strong. And it's not evil exactly. It's just hungry. It needs us to survive." The thing wearing Jake's face moved closer, and I could smell something sweet and rotten on its breath, like flowers left too long in a closed room. "Why make this harder than it has to be? One of you can leave. One of you can go back to your small, limited life. The other gets to become part of something eternal. Both of us leave," I said, "or neither of us does." "That's not how it works." The Jake thing smiled, and I saw that its teeth were no longer quite the right shape for a human mouth. "The tree needs to be fed. That's the price of passage. It's always been the price." Sarah was reading the notebook again, her lips moving silently as she traced the final entries. "Marcus," she said quietly, "I think there might be another way." "What?" She pointed to a passage near the end of the notebook. "The tree feeds on life force, on the essence of what makes us human. But what if we gave it something else? Something that carried the same energy but wasn't us?" I followed her gaze to the small leather pouch in her pocket. The charm Dale had given her when we arrived. The one his grandmother had made. The one that had kept him safe for 63 years. "You think that thing has enough power to satisfy it?" "I don't know, but it's the only thing we have that might work." The Jake thing sensed our planning and moved closer, its movements becoming less human with each step. "Don't fight the inevitable. You can't win against something that's been here since before your species learned to walk upright." But Sarah was already moving toward the tree, pulling the charm from her pocket. The leather pouch seemed to pulse with its own inner light, and I felt a surge of hope that maybe, just maybe, we had found a loophole in the nightmare logic of this place. "Sarah, wait," I called, but she was already at the base of the tree, holding the charm above her head like an offering. "Take this instead," she said to the twisted branches above. "Take the power stored in this instead of taking us." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the tree began to shake, its branches writhing like living things, and I felt a wind rise from nowhere, carrying the smell of rain and distant lightning. The charm in Sarah's hand grew brighter, and I could see energy flowing from it into the dead wood of the tree. The Jake thing screamed, a sound that hurt to hear, and its borrowed face began to dissolve, showing glimpses of the hollow thing beneath. "You don't understand," it wailed. "The tree needs fresh life, not stored power. You're only delaying the inevitable." But even as it spoke, I could see cracks appearing in the wall of trees around us. Thin lines of light leaked through, growing wider with each passing second. The charm was burning in Sarah's hand now, its stored energy pouring into the hungry roots of the dead tree, and I realized that Dale's grandmother had been more than just a wise woman making protective talismans. She had been a guardian, preparing for this moment. The Jake thing writhed and twisted, its stolen form becoming increasingly unstable as the tree fed on the charm's power instead of our life force. "This won't last," it hissed. "The hunger will return. It always returns." But the cracks in our prison were widening, and I could see real sunlight streaming through. Not the filtered, wrong light of the clearing, but honest daylight from the world we'd left behind. I grabbed Sarah's free hand and pulled her toward the largest gap. "Now!" I shouted, "while it's distracted." We plunged through the opening just as the charm crumbled to ash in Sarah's palm. Behind us, I heard the Jake thing let out a wail of rage and loss, but the sound was already fading, becoming distant and hollow. We tumbled out of the gap and found ourselves on the main trail, perhaps 100 yards from where we'd left it to follow the unmarked path. The afternoon sun was warm on our faces, and the normal sounds of the forest, birds calling, insects buzzing, wind in the leaves, felt like a symphony after the oppressive silence of the clearing. "Jake," Sarah gasped, looking around wildly. "Where's Jake?" But there was no sign of him, no trace that he had ever existed except for our memories, which felt increasingly uncertain, like dreams examined in daylight. Had there ever been a Jake? Had we come here alone, just the two of us, and somehow manufactured a third person to make the horror more bearable? I checked my phone and found it working again, showing dozens of missed calls from Sarah's mother in my office. According to the timestamp, we'd been gone for 3 days, though it felt like hours since we'd left our campsite that morning. "We have to go back," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "We have to find him. There is no back," I said gently. "Look." She turned to see what I was pointing at. The unmarked trail we'd followed into Nightmare was gone, vanished as completely as if it had never existed. The main path continued straight ahead, exactly as shown on our maps, with no side branches or mysterious cairns to lead the unwary astray. We walked back to the campground in silence, each of us struggling to process what we'd experienced. The rational part of my mind insisted that we'd gotten lost, become disoriented, perhaps suffered from some kind of shared hallucination brought on by altitude and stress. But I could still feel the echo of that presence trying to invade my thoughts, still smell the sweet corruption of the clearing. Dale was waiting for us at our RV, his pale eyes studying our faces with something that might have been relief. "You look like you've seen things," he said quietly. "Jake," Sarah said, and I heard the desperate hope in her voice. "Have you seen Jake? My cousin. He was with us when we left this morning." Dale's expression didn't change. "You two checked in alone. Been just the two of you since you arrived." Sarah looked at me with growing panic. "That's not right. Tell him, Marcus. Tell him about Jake." But as I opened my mouth to speak, I found the memories slipping away like water through my fingers. Had there been someone else? The name felt familiar, but I couldn't quite picture a face to go with it. There were gaps in my recollection, spaces where another person might have been, but probably hadn't. "The charm," I said to Dale. "It worked." He nodded slowly. "My grandmother's charms always did what they were meant to do, though the price ain't always what you expect it to be." "What do you mean?" "Sometimes saving someone means letting them go in a different way. Sometimes the kindest thing the forest can do is help you forget what you're not strong enough to remember." I felt Sarah's hand slip into mine, and I squeezed it gently. Whatever we'd lost in that clearing, whoever we'd lost, we still had each other, and perhaps that was enough. That night, we packed up the RV in preparation for an early departure. Neither of us spoke about staying the full 3 days we'd planned. Some experiences are too large to be contained by vacation schedules. As we loaded the last of our gear, I found a notebook wedged behind one of the storage compartments. It was yellow with age and moisture, and the cover bore a name in fading blue ink. Michael Chen. But when I opened it, the pages were blank, as if whatever story they'd once contained had been gently erased. I showed it to Sarah, but she just shrugged. "Probably left by a previous renter. Should we turn it into Dale?" "No," I said, slipping the notebook into my jacket pocket. "I think it's supposed to come with us." We left the Whispering Pines campground as the sun crested the ridge, driving east toward a world that suddenly felt precious and fragile. In the rearview mirror, I watched the trees close behind us like curtains at the end of a play. For weeks afterward, I would wake in the middle of the night with the taste of sweet corruption in my mouth and the echo of alien thoughts pressing against my consciousness. Sarah suffered similar disturbances. Nightmares that left her gasping and disoriented, moments of feeling watched when she was alone. But gradually, the episodes faded. The memories of our experience became hazy and uncertain, like half-remembered dreams. We never spoke about what happened in the clearing. though sometimes I would catch Sarah staring into space with an expression of profound loss, as if mourning someone she couldn't quite recall. The notebook remained in my desk drawer, its blank pages a reminder of mysteries that were perhaps better left unsolved. Sometimes, late at night when I couldn't sleep, I would take it out and flip through the empty pages, searching for some trace of the story that had once been written there. I never found anything, but occasionally, when the light hit the paper just right, I could almost see the ghost of words, fragments of someone else's nightmare, warnings that had been carefully, mercifully erased. 6 months later, Sarah and I were married in a small ceremony attended by friends and family. In the photographs from that day, we look happy but somehow incomplete, as if we're unconsciously making space for someone who should have been there but wasn't. We never went camping again. When people asked why, we would make excuses about being too busy, about preferring hotels to roughing it in the wilderness, but the truth was simpler and more complicated than that. We had learned that some places in the world are not meant for human visitation, and some experiences are too dangerous to risk repeating. Dale retired 6 months after our visit, according to a news article I found online. The Whispering Pines campground was sold to a development company that planned to clear the forest and build vacation homes. But when the bulldozers arrived, they found nothing but empty land. No trees, no creek, no trace that a campground had ever existed there. The article quoted the development company's foreman as saying, "It's the damnedest thing. According to our maps and surveys, this should be prime forest land. But there's nothing here. Just empty ground that doesn't want to hold anything." I printed out that article and kept it with the blank notebook, though I couldn't have said why. Perhaps because it felt like proof that our experience had been real, even if the details were slipping away like smoke. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when Sarah and I are sitting together in our living room, I catch myself listening for a third voice in our conversation. A presence that should be there but isn't. A gap in our shared experience that shapes itself around the absence of someone we once knew but can no longer remember. And sometimes, in the space between sleeping and waking, I hear that voice again, distant and fading, but still carrying its desperate warning. Don't look at it. I never do. Whatever it was that the voice was trying to protect me from, whatever truth lies hidden in the blank pages of Michael Chen's notebook, I've learned that some knowledge is too dangerous to pursue. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Some warnings are meant to be heeded without understanding. The Bridger Teton National Forest still exists, of course, still draws thousands of visitors each year to its pristine wilderness and scenic trails. But if you ever find yourself on an unmarked path marked with a cairn and orange tape, if you ever stumble into a clearing where nothing grows and a dead tree stands sentinel over scattered belongings, remember this story. Remember that some places in the world are hungry, and that they feed on more than just flesh and blood. They feed on memory, on identity, on the small things that make us who we are. And if you hear a voice warning you not to look at something, listen to it. Some sights are not meant for human eyes, and some prices are too high to pay for curiosity. The last entry in my own journal, written the night we returned from that trip, reads simply, "We went camping. We came back changed. I can't remember how." I've read those words hundreds of times since then, searching for clues about what we lost in that forest. But the memory remains frustratingly elusive, like trying to hold on to a dream that dissolves the moment you wake. Perhaps that's for the best. Perhaps forgetting is its own kind of mercy, a gift from whatever force watches over the spaces between the known and the unknowable. All I know for certain is that we went into the Bridger Teton National Forest as 3 people, and we came out as 2. And somewhere in the wilderness, in a clearing that may or may not exist, depending on who's looking for it, something waits with the patience of stone and the hunger of winter. Don't look for it. Don't listen for the voices that call your name from beyond the tree line. And if you ever find yourself on an unmarked trail in a place that feels too quiet, too empty, too eager to swallow your footsteps, turn around and walk away. Some adventures aren't worth surviving. The stranger's last words still echo in my memory. across months of healing and forgetting. Don't look at it. I never learned who he was or what he was warning me against. But I've carried those words with me like a talisman, a reminder that some knowledge comes at too high a price. Because in the end, the most important thing isn't what we saw in that clearing or what we lost to save ourselves. The most important thing is that we listened to the warning, fought against the hunger that wanted to consume us, and found our way back to a world where human love and courage still matter. Even if we can't remember exactly how we did it. Even if we can't remember who helped us do it. Even if the price of survival was forgetting someone who might have been the most important person in our lives. The blank notebook sits in my desk drawer, its empty pages a monument to mysteries better left unsolved. And sometimes, on the darkest nights, I think I can almost see words forming on those pages. A story trying to tell itself. A warning trying to find its voice. But I never look too closely. I've learned to take the stranger's advice to heart. I don't look at it, and neither should you.